So welcome everyone to this Foundation for Water Research, or FWR webinar, Future Home Life with Water in New Build Residential Developments. This event has been organised by the FWR, an independent community of professionals from across the water sector and related scientific specialisms. The community comes together for deliberative discussion to support the development of interdisciplinary solutions to water challenges. It provides guidance and strategic thought leadership for the IES's water activities and collaborates with the wider IES families on issues related to land, air, and policy implementation. Shortly, I will post a link in the chat where you can sign up for the free FWR newsletter if you're interested, which can help you to stay up to date with topical issues in the water sector as well as our wider work. We're really pleased today to be joined by Dr. Ella Foggitt, Research Associate at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester. Ella's research examines the socio-political and environmental sustainability dimensions of water, sanitation and health challenges, with a focus on governance and everyday life. As always, this presentation will be followed by a Q&A at the end, so please do put any questions into the Q&A box throughout, and I will read these out later on your behalf. Thank you so much, Ella, for taking the time to be with us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Ethne, and good afternoon, everyone. So, as mentioned, today I'm going to talk a bit about some social sciences work that I'm doing with Claire Houlihan and Alison Brown at the University of Manchester, where we're investigating people's priorities and perspectives on this topic of future home life with water in new build residential housing developments in England and Wales. So no doubt you'll be all too familiar with the challenges facing our water system. So I'm not going to talk through each of these in any depth, but the key thing that I wanted to highlight here is that this is a really complex problem space for multiple reasons. So there are countless imperatives for us to rethink how we manage our water systems and our water resources. And targets for substantial house building are going to add extra strain on a system that's already under significant pressure. And what this means is that tackling these water challenges is contingent on really significant coordinated action well beyond the water industry itself. And the important role of water in other sectors such as housing really needs to be better recognised, with water being understood as a key part of long-term sustainable and resilient housing in a way that energy has increasingly become sort of incorporated within the housing agenda, but water perhaps slightly less so. And one of the challenges here is when we're talking about like water management, we're often talking about timelines of, say, 2050. But of course, the homes and the residential developments that are being designed, and even those that are being built now, they're going to be lived in for long after then. So there's a challenge around timeframes as well. But if we are able to intervene in how new housing developments and the water systems that serve them are designed, are delivered and maintained, then we can begin to embed more resilient ways of using water by the people, the residents who will come to live in these new homes and developments. So it's really important that we understand how the professionals who are designing and governing these new builds are envisaging future residents and what they're envisaging their future lifestyles to be like, because it's these expectations of these professionals that then go on to shape what is or isn't being built into a development, and therefore the ways of living that become more or less likely in these new homes. So our work at Manchester is oriented around people's day-to-day lives and their everyday practices that consume water. So really mundane things that we might all do every day, things like showering, like watering the garden, like toilet flushing, for example. And the work that we're doing at the University of Manchester is part of the Enabling Water Smart Communities project, often referred to as EWSC. And some of you you might already be familiar with it, but for those who aren't, EWSC is an innovation project that it's looking at the relationship between integrated water management and housing development, with a view to unlock new opportunities for collaboration, delivery, and long-term stewardship. And at EWSC, we're interested in the overlap between housing and water and the sort of intersecting problems that these two sectors are facing. And we talk about water systems as the sort of entry point for this project, but EWSC is really interested in these wider questions about how new housing developments with integrated water management work towards these wider social and environmental outcomes. And EWSC is led by Anglian Water, along with Thames, with United Utilities and many others, and it's funded through the Ofwat Water Breakthrough Challenge Fund. And when we're thinking about water smart communities, we're particularly thinking of new housing developments where technical solutions are combined with social solutions to contribute to a more sustainable future. So technical solutions could be anything from SUDs, so sustainable drainage systems, to water reuse systems, perhaps. And sort of social solutions might be things like altered everyday routines. And the University of Manchester's role in this project is to understand what sorts of expectations people have. So these people might be professionals or potential future residents, and the expectations that they have of new housing and of sustainable water futures, and how these sustainable water futures fit into that picture. And so we're really trying to think about new developments in their entirety. So not just the sort of water fixtures and fittings within the developments, and also what this means for how and why water is used. Apologies about the dog, he will stop in 1 second. Joys of working from home. So in terms of the method, I'm not going to go into this in any depth here in the interest of time, but in a nutshell, we conducted a review of documents initially. These were sort of industry documents, including like housing brochures and policy documents. And these documents we were looking at that portray certain visions for life in new housing developments in the UK or in new water smart communities in the UK specifically. And I'll talk about the initial findings from that review in a moment. And then the Q method study sort of formed the rest of the research that we've done today. And Q method is an approach that's designed to study subjectivity. And we ran Q method workshops with members of the public and with professionals, so professionals from across the water, environment and housing sectors. And we asked these people to individually rank about 50 statements to answer the question, what are the most important considerations for new build homes and communities? And the statements were informed by the previous stage, so the review of policy, practice and academic literature. And then we analyse that data to identify sort of clusters of perspectives within those groups of members of the public and professionals, and explored some of those perspectives in more depth through follow-on interviews and a focus group discussion. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the findings that are coming out through this work. So looking at the findings emerging from the review of housing brochures and other sort of industry and policy documents initially, one of the issues that the EWSC project is interested in is this challenge around the stewardship of water smart assets. So how these assets are going to be managed and maintained in the long term within new developments. And in the documents that we reviewed, we found that community stewardship of infrastructures, including sort of green-blue infrastructures like SUDs, community stewardship was mentioned as being desirable in these documents, but there was very little detail on how it would be achieved in practice. And I think part of this stems back to community stewardship of blue-green infrastructure. It was mentioned a fair bit in guidance documents, but it wasn't really mentioned so much in documents relating to developments that are already in existence. So there was relatively limited evidence of community stewardship happening in practice, and even less evidence around, if it was happening, how it had been achieved. But nonetheless, in the guidance documents, there were various different mechanisms that were mentioned that could facilitate community stewardship. But as I say, certainly less evidence of how they've been implemented in practice. But United Utilities are leading a package of work around community stewardship in water smart communities. So if you're interested in learning more, do head over to the EWSC website and you can learn more about their work there. And then looking more, again, informed by the document review that we did, looking more specifically at how people are expected to live in water smart communities. At a high level, we found that the services that are provided by water, they remain relatively unchanged in the home to homes that are already in existence now. There were things like water efficient fixtures, but nothing that really fundamentally changed how people might interact or live with water day to day. But there were some sort of nuanced changes. So certain aspects of day-to-day life were slightly different. One example was quite a few developments and the homes within them were being designed to enable sort of working from home. And working from home potentially has potentially could affect when and where water is consumed, shifting from sort of commercial settings to within the home. And previous work has also shown that it can, as I say, change when in the day it is that people are, for example, showering. But it was primarily outside the home and more at the sort of blue-green spaces within developments that things appeared a little bit less ordinary. And so I'll talk you through a couple of examples of what I mean by that just now. So this comes back to the point I mentioned earlier around our work studying housing developments in their entirety. So active travel, so things like cycling, scooting, walking. Active travel was featured in plans for many of the new developments that we studied. And it was designed to be enabled through, for example, shade provision, street design, but also cycle and water infrastructure with showers in office blocks and other things like that. But we know that there's a potential for an increase in active travel to contribute to altered water demand. And this relates to sort of showering and bathing, but also clothes washing as people seek to stay sort of clean and comfortable after having, for example, commuted via bicycle. So we're encouraging sort of greater consideration of the potential water demand implications of these sort of water adjacent issues like active travel. Another example relates to gardening. So communal gardens were often featured in sort of visions for new developments. And they were often acknowledged as a source of sort of community cohesion and a means of spending time with neighbours and fostering shared interests. So it's sort of viewed through quite like a social lens. And there's a quote here from the Oakfield development that sort of exemplifies this. But from a watery perspective, scaling up gardens to shared spaces and from the sort of private sphere of your back garden to the semi-public sphere of communal gardens, that opens up new opportunities for more sustainable water use in gardening by, for example, scaling up rainwater harvesting systems beyond individual houses. And so these opportunities for more potentially sustainable water-related practices in gardens, they do seem to be recognised in some developments, but not consistently across them. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm primarily going to talk through our Q method work. So this is the findings emerging from the analysis of that ranking exercise that I mentioned that we conducted with members of the public and also with professionals, where we asked them to rank those, I think it was 47 statements. So firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit through the results coming out through the ranking exercise completed by members of the public. And when we talk about members of the public, we were framing them as essentially sort of potential future residents of these water smart communities. So The first sort of high-level takeaway from this group is that there is no single perspective that represents the public's view or their priorities for water smart communities. In fact, our analysis revealed 4 perspectives that were held by the people who participated in our study. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of each of those 4 perspectives on the next couple of slides. But first, I just want to highlight that across this group of people, they did have a degree of consensus on a couple of themes. The first of these was around the sort of principles that should guide water smart communities. And there were a couple that they considered were high importance. So the first was around thinking about future generations and carefully managing water resources to help sort of protect them, and also partially contributing towards that, reducing current water demand in day-to-day life in new developments. And then the second point of consensus was around certain forms of resident participation. And it's important to say that in this set of statements, we had multiple statements around resident participation. There was a degree of consensus around some of them and not around others. But the two that there was a degree of consensus around, and these were quite consistently ranked as relatively low importance, were resident engagement in citizen science initiatives. So things like residents being involved in water quality testing, and also residents being involved in decision making on water-related, sort of local water-related issues. So now I'm going to move on to look at the 4 perspectives that our analysis identified and delve into some of the specifics of them. Now, there is a lot of nuance within these, and obviously in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to delve into loads of depth about all the nuances, but hopefully this will give you a good sort of flavour of what's coming out through the analysis so far. So for the group of people who held the first perspective, for them, self-sufficiency was a really core theme. And this was self-sufficiency in terms of water resources, but also more broadly, so thinking about things like systems of food provision, thinking about how white goods within the home could be repaired rather than replaced, and repaired by the residents themselves rather than outsourcing. Also important for this group was using sort of quick fixes that don't require innovations for new technologies, and therefore that can be implemented promptly. And part of that was using SUDs, sustainable drainage systems, and processing water where it lands. Also, water reuse systems and measures that can help to reduce runoff and increase water storage with a view to help tackle combined sewer overflows and reduce the strain on existing systems, or at least not increase the strain on existing systems through new homes. But then financial changes were a low priority for this group. And then for the group of people who held the second perspective, so for them, they really prioritize technological solutions to improve water efficiency. So they might be considered the sort of early adopters of new technical innovations. And novel technologies, so things like waterless washing machines that aren't currently widely available, they were framed as having a really important role to play in reducing water demand in new developments, as well as some of the more sort of typical water efficient fixtures and fittings as well. But another feature of this perspective were concerns around governance. So thinking about blue-green infrastructure, people were concerned about the capacity of local authorities to maintain blue-green spaces, or the potential challenges around their capacity and sort of the resources that were available to them, but also didn't feel that it was necessarily the place of private companies to be maintaining these spaces, as they tend to be sort of profit driven, and they weren't quite sure what that meant for the maintenance of blue-green spaces generally, but nonetheless, this issue of governance was really important for them. And then people who held the third perspective, so they were really interested in considering the bigger picture. So issues of flooding were really important for this group of people, and also designing new homes that help to tackle pollution was really important. So this included water pollution, but also they were thinking about other sort of environmental impacts of water supply. So things like greenhouse gas emissions linked to water heating within homes. And while sort of changes, so things like fitting homes with smart water meters was a priority, so too was sort of seeing the bigger picture so that you have a strong foundation for really sustainable, longer term sort of planning and housing development. And an interesting feature of this perspective was that they were supportive of certain aspects of local living, such as working from home, but not of others. So issues like sort of homegrown food, communal gardening, they ranked that really low, with a sense that when we were talking through with people in interviews, there was a sense that, well, if there's a supermarket locally, there's no need to grow your own food. So that was an interesting characteristic of that group, as was their concerns around inclusivity and sort of potential unintended consequences of certain changes. So one particular example there was around someone said if white goods were being repaired by the residents themselves, then that could potentially have a knock-on impact on people whose livelihoods rely on repairing appliances and white goods, etc. And then finally, for the fourth perspective, they diverged quite significantly from the second perspective, because for the fourth perspective, they emphasized quality, not technology. In fact, there was some technological hesitancy within this fourth perspective. So minimizing water demand was really important for this group, both through water reuse, but also through reducing leakage. And they saw sort of installing high quality fixtures and fittings in new homes as a really important win-win, and that prioritization of sort of quality also sort of scaled up to quality of the home building itself. But as I mentioned, there was some technological hesitancy around sort of novel infrastructures and technologies, and there were concerns that new technologies might be a step too far at the moment. It's sort of too much too soon. So in a nutshell, the members of the public who participated in this study, they wanted new homes to address multiple social, environmental, and other concerns, whether that be concerns around affordability or inclusivity, for example. Water is, of course, one of just countless other issues that they're also trying to consider when thinking about priorities for new homes. And the issue of trust is really important for people, both trust in technologies, but also sort of institutions or particular stakeholders, and that affects the degree to which they support different changes. And many different sort of considerations were shaping people's priorities and people's perspectives, and these range from sort of environmental considerations to more social or financial concerns. And then I'm just going to really quickly talk you through the professionals' perspectives. We're still doing the analysis for this, so I'm not going to go into lots of detail, and this will develop further. But at quite a high level, so the group of professionals who participated in our study, there was an acknowledgement among them that current ways of doing things, both with water and housing, need to change. Many of the professional participants noted that system-wide changes, so these might be things like shifts in the practices of regulators, these had a greater potential to resolve environmental problems than technical solutions at a household scale. And our analysis of the professionals' data, this revealed 3 perspectives held by that participant group. And at a sort of, again, a very high level, the first perspective really prioritised water reuse as a way to help achieve a step change in water demand in new developments. And an underlying principle for that group was careful management of water for future generations. And then the second perspective prioritized really interesting lots of water adjacent issues. So these were things like active travel, accessible green spaces. So they diverged quite a lot from the perspectives held by the other 2 groups. And then for perspective 3, that was all about designing new developments that contributed to addressing multiple water problems simultaneously. So these included addressing leakage, flooding, and water use, and they felt that addressing all these problems was really really important, and it was important that they were all done sort of alongside each other simultaneously. So by way of sort of summing up, I'm just gonna draw on a few reflections and initial implications that we've sort of identified, but I'm really interested to hear any reflections that any of you have too. But firstly, our work is helping to sort of highlight the importance of considering how water-related practices interact with other systems. So things like food provision in the case of gardening, sort of energy services, transport infrastructures in the case of active travel. And how important it is that we help to sort of mitigate shifts in certain practices, such as active travel, altering the resource intensity of water consumption. And secondly, we found that while public support is often sort of framed as for or against when we're thinking about, well, lots of issues, but in this case, new water infrastructures and new water technologies. But actually, there's a lot more to it than that usually. Like, people have a whole variety of different priorities, different concerns. And in order to design and deliver water smart communities that meet the needs of that diverse population, we really need to think through the diverse set of concerns that people have. And it's really important that people's different starting points are recognised and they're addressed, because people need to see any changes happening and working for them rather than happening to them. And then our work revealed that both support and resistance towards any given issue, it takes many different forms and generally came with multiple different conditions and caveats. Like, there was a lot of yes, but, no, unless. And it's really important that this complexity is understood so that these new technologies or practices could potentially be popularized and normalized with a view to sort of enable more positive social and environmental outcomes of these new developments. And my final reflection was around governance and how sort of important it is that the governance processes ensure the safety and the reliability of these new systems, both in terms of their implementation, but also their maintenance, because study participants, particularly from the members of the public participant group, they cited various different concerns around sort of the trust in technologies, but also in institutions related to that. Yeah, so to sum up, our work at the University of Manchester, we're trying to unravel some of the sort of complex, multiple perspectives that are held by the public and by professionals, and to demonstrate the priorities that might need to be addressed in order to support changes in building design, in construction, and in maintenance, with a view to support more sustainable water futures. And we found that people hold multiple perspectives on the future of water and housing, and these concerns that people have and the priorities that they feel should be implemented are really quite diverse. As I mentioned just now, we found that support was dependent on trust, but also on concerns around safety and affordability and sort of repair and maintenance. And our review found that various new ways of living that have potential implications for water use are being sort of envisaged in the design and planning of new developments. So it's important that these potential implications are sort of acknowledged and considered in the context of water. So I've given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of our work on the project. There's still more data to be collected, more analysis to do. So these are the sort of high-level sort of findings emerging from our research. And if you're interested in learning any more about our work or about our project, and the EWSC website link is there, and there's a couple of QR codes that you can use to navigate to some recent publications about the work that we're doing in the workshops that we've run. So yeah, very happy to hear any reflections from you. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ella. Really useful to hear about that project and some really interesting results there. So thanks so much for joining us today. As Ella just said, please do put any questions in the Q&A box because we'll move straight on to those now, or any comments as well in the chat. So just to kick things off, Ella, I'm going to go to the first question, which is around whether you could expand a little bit more on the focus group composition, with the point that if there was there a wide variety of age and backgrounds, as some responses may imply a kind of different life perspective. So it'd be good to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, fab question. So the sampling for the focus group discussion that was informed by the 4 different perspectives. So the focus group was held with members of the public specifically, and it was held with people who had participated in the previous phase of the research. So people who'd completed that ranking activity. So we sampled to ensure that there was at least one person, but there were multiple people who held each perspective, each of those 4 perspectives within the focus group, as well as a couple of people who didn't hold either of those 4 perspectives. Demographically, yes, it was varied somewhat, but it was primarily driven by the perspective that they held in terms of our sampling. And the work that Claire and Ali have done to date around like patterns of water use, that has shown that sociodemographics are important, and things like age are important to some degree, but often it's more linked to sort of people's day-to-day routines and their lifestyles in terms of sort of water consumption practices day to day.
Great, thank you very much. Kind of building on what you touched on there, obviously it was really an interesting part of this project was seeing the kind of diversity of public opinion and how there wasn't really kind of one key message coming out. I wonder if you have any reflections on how you think we could work to kind of to support building some consensus amongst the public. Is it around that we need more evidence around different types of interventions to inform their view, or is it that we probably can't build a consensus and that just needs to kind of be different interventions in different places?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I'm not sure I have a fully formed. I think that's something I'm still sort of thinking through at the moment. But I think really we need to acknowledge that these diverse perspectives exist, and like, yeah, there's never going to be like a single view that represents the general public. Like, we're all very different. We all hold quite different views, and yeah, so I think there will always be a diversity of perspectives, and that just needs to be factored in. And I just think it's really important that people are engaged with, so that they, yeah, whatever their perspective, their different starting point is acknowledged, and they can be sort of taken along with the journey as compared to it being just sort of imposed on them, if you like.
Great, thanks. And you mentioned in your presentation around regulators, and I just wondered if there'd been or are there plans to engage with regulators and policymakers in some of this work as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're already actively engaging with different policymakers. So DEFRA are engaged with our work, and we've been speaking with them about what we're doing. And the project is is funded by Ofwat, so one of the water regulators, but we're also engaging with different bits of the housing industry as well. And there are also some various changes going on around sort of like water performance certificates and various different things. So we're engaging in relevant consultations through those sorts of channels too.
That's great. Thank you. That's good to know. Um, and I wonder if there'd been, and maybe this is kind of outside of the scope of this project a little bit, but it'd be interesting to know your thoughts. Obviously, and internationally, there's kind of different ways that water is managed in the home. I'm thinking of the purple pipe system, for example. I don't know if you're familiar in America. Were any of those kinds of interventions thought about when you were kind of considering some of the different potential ways forward for future home life?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our initial document review, our focus on case studies was in the UK, but there was work done by the University of East Anglia that also drew on examples of water smart communities from Australia. And Professor Alison Brown, who I work with at the University of Manchester, has done a significant body of research around people's day-to-day lives with water in Australia. So we drew on various different examples, primarily from Australia, I'd say, but also there's some really interesting literature from the Global South around the importance of sort of like systems of maintenance and of repair around water infrastructures and sort of decentralized systems. So we also sort of included that in the mix.
That's great. That's really interesting. Um, And obviously, kind of fundamental to the work that you've been doing is kind of the importance of trying to limit unintended consequences of some interventions on other areas, and particularly water in this case. I wonder if you have any views on how kind of a systems approach can be taken to some of these issues. Like, what are some key success factors for this, in your opinion, that developers or regulators or policymakers should be thinking about?
Oh, I like that question. I th I think it's really challenging, and I think perhaps the most important thing, which isn't new, is communication and doing our utmost to not work in silos. And I know this is said all the time, and it's a lot easier said than done. But I do think that's really important, like open communication channels. And it's something that on this project we're really trying to do, and it's challenging. It's really challenging. Um, so yeah, I think just at really high level, trying to keep open communication across multiple different sectors and this sort of interdisciplinary thinking, I think that's really key.
That's great. Thank you. So it was a bit of a mean question. It's one that I'm also trying to think about how you can kind of break down the silos between different areas. So that's really interesting. Um, Another question here from an attendee, which was just I wonder if you know the answer to this, is how does the UK water consumption per person compare to kind of the EU or comparable nations at the moment in the UK? And do we know kind of how it's predicted to change?
Oh, that's a great question. It's actually not one I really have the answer to. So my expertise is primarily around sort of more broadly. Like I don't focus. So Claire and Alison are a lot more focused specifically around water consumption and reducing water demand. My sort of field of expertise is on water and sanitation a lot more broadly, not specifically water demand. So yeah, I'd have to polish up on the different documents. So I think it's challenging to answer that specifically, but I do know that there are really concerning sort of projected supply demand deficits by DEFRA, as I think I showed on that first slide. So there's certainly in the UK, I know that there's an awful lot that needs to be done to reduce that supply demand deficit in terms of projected consumption. But yeah, in terms of the broader where that fits within sort of Europe and beyond, I'd have to double check. I'm sorry.
No, no problem at all. Thank you. And actually, last question now, if that's all right. Thank you for kind of answering all of those. I just wondered if you could have some reflections on kind of other research that you'd like to see that's similar to this that would complement your findings. Are there any kind of key areas that you think there's really important need for more evidence in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think. Something that we're trying to do through our work, and it would be great to see others do too, is to try and unpack some of the complexity of people's perspectives on this topic, but also on sort of water reuse specifically is something that we're interested in, because I think a lot of studies that have been done around water reuse are often sort of using surveys, which certainly have their role. But what Q methodology allows us to do is to sort of unpack the nuances in people's perspectives on like new technologies like water reuse systems, for example, or relatively novel ones in the UK at least. So yeah, I think it would be really interesting to see more research that's trying to unpack the complexity of how people feel about some of those new systems.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ella, and thank you for answering all those questions and for joining us today. It was a really interesting presentation, and yeah, I'd also be interested to know about water reuse and how that kind of fits into the picture. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of our attendees as well for taking the time to come today. I really hope you enjoyed the presentation as well. If you are an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar using our CPD tool, and you can find that by logging into the IES members area of the website. If you're watching the recording on YouTube, please do subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content. For now, thank you once again to Ella and to all of you for coming along. Have a lovely rest of your day.